Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Leon, and today I'll be talking about the piece I spent almost an entire year working on, like 9 months, the memory of things left unsaid for string orchestra. Throughout this presentation, you'll see video clips of musicians from the Network for New Music who did a read-through of my piece and helped produce a fantastic recording. So I'll be talking about my background in music, early sketches of the piece, themes and motifs found in movements 1 and 2, how I went about crafting the ending, and then I'll conclude with my final recording and a few remarks on the rehearsal process and conclusions, after which I'll be open for questions. So my background in music. To give everyone some context about me as a musician, I started my life as a percussionist in 9th grade. I didn't know how to read music, and I didn't know about certain genres of music, like jazz. To be honest with you, I didn't even know how to listen to music. Like, I didn't pay attention to a bass line in songs until I started playing the bass. So that kind of just shows you like how naive I was about music. My compositional interest started in 11th and 12th grade when I was given the opportunity to write for the rhythm section, to write for a few jazz charts. Freshman year of college, my compositional interest grew even more, specifically with film music after watching the Houston Symphony perform Harry Potter live. And since then, I knew I wanted to compose a piece for string orchestra. Aside from composing, I've been teaching high school marching percussion for the past 4 years, and last year I was given the opportunity to compose the percussion parts for the marching show, tailoring the parts to the difficulties of my students to have them grow. Going through the process of composing the parts, to teaching the parts, to seeing them perform live was pretty sweet, pretty incredible, and reaffirmed my passion for both composition and music education. And lastly, with the Stephen Gerber Fund, I was able to attend the NYU Film Scoring Workshop, where I worked with many musicians ranging from high schoolers to 40-year-old professionals in the industry, where I made lifelong friends that I still keep up with, and it was my first time ever experiencing a rehearsal with live musicians from the Budapest Symphony Orchestra. So up next, we have my early sketches. I think before I dive into showing you what this piece looked like in its early stages, I should talk about my influences. So I'm largely influenced by wind ensemble music, the experience of listening to film score music and how it kind of just immerses you in an environment of sound and it's more of an experience, and the seemingly simple yet very complex language of music from the Romantic era. So some examples of this are Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings, Gustav Mahler's Symphony No. 5 in C# minor, and Hans Zimmer's soundtrack for Inception. When I first started thinking about my piece back in July, I drafted my first sketch. But that first draft, I kind of like threw most of it away. The only thing that stuck was the opening idea, which was just like one idea followed by lots of chords. There wasn't anything of substance really, except for that opening. But to me, that's all that mattered because I was able to create a whole movement from that one idea. So here we have the early sketches. You can see that this is what will remain the same, these 2 pages basically. But I did make a lot of alterations. So here I adjusted the tempo, so instead of it being pretty slow, I ramped it up. And that changed the momentum, but kept the same feeling. And then as you can see here, this is just me trying to put stuff down on paper. So like here, we went from 72 to 160 to 80, and so there's just like a lot of different disjunct pieces, and they're not really continuous. So now we have the themes and motifs in my first movement. My first movement is titled Echoes That Refuse to Settle, and this is because the first theme is kind of left unanswered or unresolved. Here's what that sounds like. Wonder like what should come next. I'm not really sure what to expect, and that's kind of what I was going for. Here I continued the theme you just heard in violin 2s, and I introduced some more accompaniment in the other instruments, and here in the cello you'll see a rhythmic motif or idea that we'll see interspersed throughout the movement. We also have this extension here in the blue. It's just an extension of the opening. Now here, I would just like to introduce a very important theme that will serve as material for the ending. Kind of just to prime your ear, you know, when you see this orange line here, you know what it should sound like and you know where I grab future material from. And the more I began to compose, the more I began to think about music in a different way. I started to think about the spatial relationships between instruments. So what happens if I played something and then I give it to the cello, and then the cello plays something and they give that same passage to the violin twos. And so this spread of ideas or different voices playing different things is an example of counterpoint. And so here you see this purple idea is passed to the violas, then the violin twos have it, then the violin ones have it. And so here's what that sounds like. And instead of having all the instruments play something at the same time and have one instrument have the primary melody, I began to pass it around to different instruments. For example, here I talked about how it goes from the violin one to the viola, then it goes to the second violin, and then it goes back to the first violin. And I would just like to introduce some rhythmic motifs. You don't really need to hear these. I just want to introduce the colors so that later on, when you see my annotated score and analyzed score, you'll know what material came from movement one versus what material came from the second movement. And speaking of, here are themes and motifs from the second movement. The title of this one is Half Spoken, Half Forgotten. For this one, I went in with the mindset of wanting the movement to be more like an experience to listen to, rather than taking one idea and applying traditional methods to develop it, such as changing keys, changing the time signature or the meter, and changing the style. I wasn't worried about modulating or harmony, but I knew I wanted the movement to be simple, rhythm-wise, but harmonically complex and rich, avoiding the tonic or home chord as often. I also knew I wanted the texture to thin out and play more with the idea of counterpoint, because in that first movement, I didn't really do that all that much. It was just very dense and very straightforward. But coincidentally, this is also around the time where I started second semester and I started taking counterpoint the second semester. So everything I was learning in class, I started applying directly as soon as I could, kind of playing catch up there. So here, I want to emphasize the two halves. You can think of the melody as broken up into these two segments here, blue and purple. So the first one goes up and it's kind of like the question or the call. And it sounds pretty incomplete, right? You don't know what's coming next. And that would be the answer or the response. So together, the two halves make up the entire phrase or theme. And so here we have the original theme you just heard. So right away in measure 9, right after we hear the opening, I start to introduce counterpoint, and I break up the first half of the theme and share it between the viola and the violin 2. I also bring back rhythmic motifs from the first movement. I introduce more important motifs for this movement in particular to the listener. And I start to alter what you just heard in purple, or the answer portion of the theme. There and there. Lastly, I would just want to introduce an additional motif that I incorporate later on for the ending. This one's also broken up between instruments, specifically when the texture thins and serves as material for the end. So now on to the most daunting task, writing the ending. Well, before the actual beginning of the end, because the ending is pretty long, 2-3 minutes, I have a pretty big task ahead of me. You just listen to, or you're gonna listen to 5 minutes, right, of music, and I have to summarize that pretty concisely and make it intelligible to the listener. So I have to bring back themes and motifs from movements 1 and 2. I want the ending to be delayed, right? I can't just, end it right then and there. The ending needs to unravel. It's a process to kind of introduce all the ideas. And then I wanted to overlap, merge, and transform all of the ideas as much as I could. And lastly, I wanted a dramatic and fast ending like that of the film score. Now, I knew I would encounter lots of problems, but a few that I anticipated were the material for both movements were in different keys. That's no problem. I can just transpose it. But also, when I have multiple ideas together, adding and subtracting material is tricky because if I change something, it still needs to be identifiable to the listener. And when I do start to overlap stuff, it needs to be clear. So what does a transformation of ideas look like, and how would I end up crafting the ending? For me, that was very methodical. I would restate the material for movement 1 to remind the listener of the motifs in that movement. Then I would overlap material for both movements. Then I would recall rhythmic ideas for movement 1 and material for movement 2. And lastly, I would just continue that for as long as I possibly could. And the end result is that ideas and themes from both movements start to mesh or blur together. So here's an example of me restating in my second movement. I only bring back motivic material from movement 1. This also marks the beginning of the end. You can also notice that the texture is thin yet again. So now I begin to overlap ideas, right? So we have the first half of the theme from movement 1. Then we have the main theme from, or motif from movement 1. Sorry, movement 2 earlier. Then we have the second half of the theme from movement 2. Another motif from movement 1. And then a motif from movement 2. And here's what that sounds like. So if I were to highlight what came from each movement, it would look something like this. So no matter what, something from both movements will always be occurring in some way, shape, or form. It will either just be transformed, overlapped, recalled, or just continue. Speaking of recall, we have a recall of the counterpoint we found in movement 1 that you listened to earlier. And so I kind of just took it and I placed it there. And then I developed the idea further. So these fragments of ideas are later developed into their own line. They're no longer just fragments. Up next, we have continuation. So, like I said earlier, from this point on, in some way, shape, or form, you'll hear both movements at the same time. Now notice that the cello and the bass kind of drop out here, or they're just at this point, they've been out for a while now. And I'm like, crap, how do I bring them back in? They've kind of just been standing there, right? So the answer for me was simple. I would just restate the theme in its original form, like that. Because when you heard both of these, at least in the intro, not necessarily the cello solo, you heard a full texture. So when you hear both of these again, and I overlap them, you're expecting to hear the full ensemble playing together. And then finally, I have an ending gesture when all instruments play the same thing, and here's an example of what that sounds like. But then I encountered yet another roadblock. That ending sounded sounded pretty boring to me. I don't know if it sounded boring to you. It's okay to say yes. I didn't want the piece to end like that. It felt boring. It was too similar to the ending of the first movement. I didn't have the dramatic and fast ending that I wanted, but I did feel like I merged and mashed up together all the themes and handled the transformation of ideas quite well. So the answer to this problem actually came to me 20 minutes before I met with Professor Rocco. You see, earlier that week I watched the trailer for Mission Impossible, and as I was humming the theme for Mission Impossible on my way to the library cafe, I found myself asking myself, like, what would the film score equivalent of my piece sound like? And what would the ending of that film score equivalent piece sound like? And so, while I already had the answer in my head and eventually, jotted it down, subconsciously I was hearing the material in a different way through yet another contrapuntal idea known as augmentation. So, what is augmentation? Simply put, augmentation is when you take a musical idea and elongate it. So you probably forgot, the theme I showed you earlier, but here it is again. And so in my epic and dark ending, I employed the use of augmentation to ramp up, the intensity and keep the familiar themes and motifs happening, but give them a different role or a different context in my piece. So for this example, I took this theme and I augmented it to match this rhythm. So I basically just want to take some of these notes and just make it look like that at the end of the day. So this is what we were trying to get it to look like here, and this is where I'm trying to augment. Now, some of these notes I leave out intentionally, just because they're passing tones or because they didn't quite sound right. But I take these three notes, and then I map it onto that rhythm there. And then I take these four notes, and I map it onto that rhythm there. And so I kind of just keep going at this process. So here's the video clip of that in action. And then here it is again with the less important notes taken out. And so then we can finally augment it, or listen to it augmented. So you can kind of hear how much longer the phrase is and the note values. So then I wondered, well, what would happen, if I did the same thing to my second movement? And so I was able to just double, the note value. So up there at the top is where we just started augmenting the theme from movement one. The first half of the theme from the second movement. And so I kind of just mapped the same thing here. And here's what that sounds like. And then again for the second half of the theme from movement two. So that's where we just left off. And for this one, I had to make more alterations. So you can see I wasn't able to fully map or augment the entire thing, but that didn't really matter because I still had enough material to keep it familiar to the listener. Here's what that sounds like. And then augment it. And so I know this looks a little daunting, but while both augmented themes are going on, I also take the idea of diminution, which is the opposite of augmentation. Instead of taking an idea and elongating it, we're going to shorten it. So you can see that here and beyond in the score. We also see motifs from movement one. And then something interesting also happens. The bass here and the cello, they change their rhythm that they're playing, which is signals the end yet again. So here's what that sounds like. didn't catch that the ending was coming, here you'll definitely catch that the end is like this is the end. Lastly, I introduced the last bit of augmentation. So taking that idea we had here, the rhythm earlier, I basically just double it. So here it gets 3 beats and 1 beat, and when I introduce a counter melody in the violin 1, it now gets 6 beats and 2 beats, while the same rhythm is happening elsewhere. So now it's time for the final recording. Hope you enjoy. when I first handed the music to the musicians, I mean, they don't have, you know, the score in front of you. I mean, they had it, but not all of them read the program notes, so they didn't know what their role was in the group that you just saw. Right? It's like, I don't know when I'm supposed to be loud or when I'm supposed to back off. Like, sure, I have dynamics, but it's all relative when you're playing with the people around you. So, you know, throughout the recording session, once I kind of told them more about, like, you know, like, play out here, you know, back off here, right? Like, this instrument's important here. They began to shape the music and kind of, you know, bring it to life instead of just have it be all static. And so, I mean, when the rehearsal is costing you, you know, like $17 a minute, I mean, the time's on the clock. So, you know, you have to go with the game plan and kind of just, you know, make the biggest use of the time that you have and get it to sound, you know, exactly the way you want it. So I just want to give huge thanks to the performers and to everyone who has helped me throughout the presentation. I really appreciate it, and so thank you to everyone who's helped me throughout the process. Any questions? Yes.
Given your percussionist background, what was it like to compose exclusively for strings?
Okay, so the question was, given my, I just really like it. Given my percussionist background, what was it like to compose for exclusively strings? It was hard. I didn't know anything about strings. I mean, I didn't know anything about bowings. I didn't know. Sure, I play bass, but I mean that's completely different than using a bow. And it was really hard to have to write for 5 different instruments, or really 4 simultaneously. And so that's why in the first movement, you saw a lot of my music was very vertical, and in the second movement, you got to see a lot of diagonals, because I started to, you know, realize like, oh crap, you know, this person can actually do something whilst this other person's doing something. And so everyone can contribute something to the ensemble and have an interesting part, not just like, you know, I'm playing one thing the entire time. Yes.
What was your process like for composing with like a story or a narrative in mind? Did that come at the beginning, the middle, at the end? How do you
the question was, how did I compose like with a narrative in mind? I would say the narrative came after, if I'm being honest. It's really easy to just kind of take an idea and run with it sometimes, unless you have writer's block, which happened. But you know, once I finished the piece, I didn't have a title. I was like, you know, what do I call it? And so I just listened to it over and over and over, and I was thinking, you know, how did it make me feel? What do I want the audience to take away from my process and journey writing it? Yes.
What will future composition projects include, like in terms of instruments and style?
The question was, what do future compositional styles or instrumentation, what does that look like for me? I want to write for wind ensemble or wind symphony, and eventually get this played in front of a full orchestra, and, you know, fully orchestrated. I think it would sound good either way, instrumentation-wise, like if it were a full orchestra or not. I just think some of the clarity in certain instruments would come out a little bit more. Yes.
So you mentioned writer's block. What were a couple things that got you past the writer's block?
The question was, what are a couple things that got me past writer's block? I don't know. I mean, there were some weeks where I went to Professor Rocco and I didn't, you know, have anything done for a week. But I think just, you know, for me, I always like let it marinate, so I just stopped thinking about it and I composed something else. And then eventually, when the time was right, I'd take that idea that I composed when I had writer's block, and I'd plug it in. Or I would take, you know, a motif, a small fragment that you saw earlier, and I would just start to kind of bend it and shape it and see, you know, what can I get out of this one thing. And just speaking generally, that's one of the things that changed in my compositional process. I was very much the person who would jump from one idea to the next and then compose something that goes in between. Like, I want to have this idea and this idea, let me just write the transition. But this project and Professor Rocco really helped me take one idea and just run with it, you know, work it out until you can't get anything else from that one idea, and then you go on to the next one, and the next one. So my music kind of became more continuous rather than kind of discrete and with transformation, or transitions in the middle. Any other? Yes?
I'm a little curious to conceptualize transitions between kind of like different like ideas or motifs. Like for example, you have like a part where it's like, oh, like a dreamy waltz after kind of like a more intense portion, but like the transition there was like very smooth, and I'm kind of curious like how you sort of conceptualize that.
The question is basically how do I write transition material, I guess,
Yeah, basically.
between different concepts. I think for the second movement, for sure, it was a lot more like let me drop an instrument or let me drop the texture. But I have a lot of these like more intimate or more lush moments, you know, after you heard the ending or something more intense. That was me continuing and kind of delaying the ending, right? Like you just heard this really intense thing, then you hear something a little bit more lush. And then finally at the very end, I give you like the full like dramatic and fast ending. So for this, I would say it's just a lot about instrumentation and you know the harmonies that you're using and voice leading. Yes.
I will say I'm really gratified that you saw the importance of counterpoint and the value of it, because that's not always valued anymore in our educational process and composition. And I really felt you came into your own really in the coda. Really, really wonderful. So thank you for that, and thank you for Ingrid for that. I'm just curious about more about how that affected you. 'Cause I learned counterpoint when I was in high school with my piano teacher.
Yeah.
So, and I feel like it has always influenced my approach. It's just there always. So I'm curious about how
For me, the journey of taking counterpoint while writing the
Yeah.
movement, the second movement, I think even in the first or second class when we started, Professor Rocco mentioned augmentation, and right when I heard it, I was like, wow, like I see this a lot in film school, you know, they take this idea and they just, you know, stretch it out. So that's when I actually like started to write like in pieces a little bit. I was like, okay, I want to take this idea and put it somewhere eventually. And so I started writing like these little fragments in like my toolkit, and then from there, once I realized like where that piece could go, I started to plug in, and then just continue writing. Yes.
Was there any like harmonic form you followed for this, or how much thought did you put into chords and like underlying development?
The question is how much thought did I put into the form or the harmony? I would say that was a problem I struggled with at first. I was like, okay, Professor Rocco, tell me what form this is. Is it a sonata? Is it, you know, what is it ternary form, binary? You know, what's going on here? And you know, is it like theme and variations? And so we kind of just agreed, you know, like it doesn't need to fit one of those things. It can be whatever it becomes, and kind of just let the piece unravel. It doesn't need to fit like this one particular genre or category of form. For as far as harmony, I didn't really follow okay, let me use a secondary dominant. I only kind of followed that when I needed to get out of like, you know, when I needed to modulate or when I needed to get out of like this problem area. I kind of just started to overlap these ideas where they fit. And so I do have like my score with all the Roman numeral analysis for sure, just because I think it's very important and it informs like where I could go next and where I want to go next. It shows me like I could go to this key or I could go to this, I could do this here, but instead, let me aim for this emotion, and let me aim for this dramatic twist. Yes.
Yeah, it's actually just more a comment than a question, but having seen your score and having just heard you say a few minutes ago, I really was impressed with how carefully you made sure everybody had something interesting to do. I think that's something that even with really prominent composers, when they're writing for a huge orchestra, it's like, does the second clarinet have something to do? Does the fourth horn feel like there's enough to justify their existence? Those types of things. And it's really great to hear you talk about that and to also see in your score that you were so careful about that.
Yeah, I was a percussionist in the orchestra, so I know what it's like to kind of just stand back there and count for who knows how long and then miss a cue because you're just counting back there. So yeah, I really wanted to make sure everyone had something important to play. Yes.
So, you said that you would like to have this piece go to a full orchestra. Do you know, have you thought further into that process, or have you just, have you put it into oh, I could double this part, or have you just stated that you wanted to put this on an orchestra?
Yeah, I kind of just stated that I wanted to. I haven't really put in any thought into getting it to a full orchestra. I have thought about putting some percussion in some sections. I feel like I can hear percussion in some of the sections, whether that's cymbals or snare drum or something interesting with tympanic bass drum. But I haven't actually written out the parts. Yes.
I know that you both today stressed the importance of rehearsals for you and also have said that to me. And I was wondering what was the number one piece of feedback you got in the rehearsal of this composition.
The question was, what was the number one piece of feedback I got from the rehearsal? I think, honestly, it was more score revisions, and this would clarify my role a little bit better, or this would clarify this passage a little bit better, which, when you're preparing a score, like I said, every minute is $17. So you want to make sure that your score is as clear as it can be, right? So you don't want to have messed up dynamics, or you don't want to accidentally have things that shouldn't be in there. So when we were preparing the score, I had a lot of rehearsal letters and rehearsal markings and how you should play this and how you should play that we talked about. Professor Rocco helped me realize that would kind of cause discontinuity. It's they'd be so stressed on how to play it that they wouldn't actually play it organically. So we ended up taking a lot of that out and kind of just let it take place. And so I still have to make some of the score revisions that I got from that rehearsal, but it definitely helped me realize the next time I present this to a string orchestra, hopefully those problems won't arise at rehearsals. Yes.
How has this project helped you grow as a person outside of just music?
Question one, a daunting one. How has this project helped me grow as a person outside of just music? First one I have to actually think about. I think it's taught me the importance of just feedback and collaboration. I've had Ella listen to it countless times. God knows Professor Rupp was probably tired of hearing it. And it's just the importance of just being receptive and changing things. There were some days where I thought I went into a meeting and I was like, sweet, I just wrote 3 pages, and Professor Rupp was like, okay, we're only going to use half of this because all this other stuff is just transition material. So just really, it taught me to be patient with myself instead of just going from this idea, or just even in life, going from this thing to the next. It's let me just actually work this out and just be patient with